Have any of you read the book, The Perfect Storm, or seen the movie? Most of you, okay. It tells the harrowing tale of a fishing vessel caught in a life-threatening storm at sea out past the Grand Banks. Sebastian Junger, the author of this book, articulates these questions. How do men act on a sinking ship? Do they hold each other? Do they pass around the whiskey? Do they cry? Jesus and the disciples were once out in a storm at sea. It was a fierce storm. And how the disciples acted in a boat that was in danger of sinking is the meat of this little story. I know what it feels like to be out in a boat in scary, stormy seas. How many of you have had such an experience? Most of you. The disciples were out on the Sea of Galilee when the winds suddenly picked up and the waves began to pound into their little boat and the bottom began to fill, and they were wildly wondering if they were going to make it, asking themselves whose big idea it was to go sailing in the first place. They turned to Jesus, who was, after all, the one who had said with all authority, "Hop in the boat." Jesus, however, was sound asleep. Remarkably, he had been sleeping through the whole storm. So the disciples did what many of us would do in a crisis if we had Jesus in the boat with us. They woke him up. By the way, I take comfort in the humanity of Jesus. Jesus, fully human, fully divine. In this case, fully human. I take comfort in that humanity in stories such as this. I find solace in the idea that even Jesus became worn out, exhausted to the point of sleeping through a storm. Somehow, his sleeping through a storm makes it okay for us to be exhausted from time to time, and perhaps to sleep through a few storms of our own. When the disciples woke Jesus, they asked him a question with which we are familiar, a question many of us have put to God when we have found ourselves in one tempestuous storm or another in this earthly and often unpredictable life. Jesus, don't you care? Can't you see what we're going through here, God? Do you want us to perish? Don't you care that we are perishing? I think this was their way of saying, do something. Well, we do not have many details. An interesting feature of this little story is that the only thing the disciples do, the only action they take, is to turn to Jesus. Nowhere does it say they devised a plan for saving the boat. No one seems to be trimming the sails or taking them down. There are no references to anyone getting down into the bottom of the boat to bail it out. So many times do we behave in the same way. We are unwilling to do what we can to solve our scary problems, but we want God to save us nevertheless. Using our God-given intelligence and creativity, there are so many things we could be doing as individuals, as communities, as nations, as a planet of creatures to trim the sails, change course, bail ourselves out of scary and life-threatening situations. But sometimes we become immobilized. We sit back in the boat and we expect someone else to care, someone else to act. All the while asking, God, do you not care that we are perishing? Awakened by the frightened crew, Jesus immediately rebukes the winds and instructs the seas to be still, and then responds to the storm-tossed disciples with two questions of his own. Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? The unspoken implication here is that to be full of fear is to be short on faith. What you need on choppy seas is courageous faith, and they don't seem to have it. Jesus appears to be greatly disappointed by the depth of the disciples' fear, for fear is surely the opposite of faith. An elder in the early church wrote, "Perfect love casts out fear." However, the reverse may be true as well. Perfect fear casts out love. We see this in war. We see this in domestic violence. We see this in 2,342 children separated from their parents. Perfect fear casts out love. Out at sea, freshly awakened by the disciples, fear seems to be Jesus' greatest concern. More than anything else, he is concerned with addressing their debilitating fear. Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? These are good questions to ask of ourselves in those moments when we find ourselves in a right panic about anything. Why are we afraid? How does our faith in God, our trust in the goodness of God, inform our greatest fears? Don't you care? The disciples ask desperately. Well, Jesus does not exactly give them the answer they want. While he does not say, "I really don't care," neither does he offer a sympathetic ear. Furthermore, he does not say, "I'll fix it for you," even though he does proceed to calm the storm. What he does is confront their fears and their faithlessness. He wants them to know that God is with them at all times. He wants to see in these shaky disciples a little more confidence in the one who gave them their lives to begin with. On the scariest sail of my life, I didn't have time to be afraid. I certainly didn't have time to pass around the whiskey, as Sebastian Junger suggested. Out there on Buzzards Bay with 6-foot waves curling into our little open sailboat, I was too busy bailing, and Russ was too busy managing sails to let fear consume us. If we'd just thrown up our shaking hands and said, "God help us," we might have ended up in the drink. As the great mystic Meister Eckhart put it, the price of inaction is far greater than the cost of making a mistake. What a different story this would all be if the disciples had pulled it together, cast their fears to the wind, placed their trust in God, turned to and trimmed the sails, bailed the bottom, said to one another maybe, "Let's let Jesus sleep. He's exhausted. God has given us all the tools and skills we need. We'll wake him up when we're back ashore." Faith in God, trust in God, does not mean throwing your hands in the air when something goes wrong or when something is wrong, and hoping for divine intervention. Sometimes you are the intervention God wants. May God bless you then, and bless us all with a deep care, with courageous initiative, and with a fearless faith when the seas get choppy. Amen.